They said he was just a symbolic leader from a small African country. Putin even laughed when Traoré asked to see the fighter jets. But 15 minutes after takeoff, no one in Russia was laughing anymore. What happened next shook the Kremlin and proved to the world that true power doesn't always wear medals. Moscow, late autumn. The sky was gray, the air laced with military precision. Burkina Faso's president, Ibrahim Traoré, stepped off his modest plane with quiet confidence. His visit to Russia was officially a diplomatic courtesy, but beneath the handshakes and ceremonial welcomes, he could feel it. The condescension. President Vladimir Putin greeted him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome, Comrade Traoré. We have some toys you might enjoy seeing." The Russian generals chuckled. A translator politely translated, but Ibrahim didn't need the translation to hear the mockery in their tone. They showed him the latest Sukhoi 35 fighter jets. Standing on a runway of a secured Russian air base, Putin gestured proudly at the jet like a man flaunting a trophy. "You ever flown one of these?" Putin asked. "No," Ibrahim answered, "but I can." The laughter came before the translator could even speak. Ibrahim's eyes narrowed slightly, but his face remained calm. He had expected this. The dismissal, the patronizing smiles. It was the same look he had seen throughout his life, from his military training days to his ascension to leadership. The Russian officials guided him through their military complex with rehearsed pride, gleaming missiles, armored vehicles, and communication systems that could coordinate attacks across continents. At each display, they glanced at him, measuring his reaction, expecting awe. But Ibrahim wasn't there to be impressed. He nodded politely, asking technical questions that surprised them. This wasn't in their script. The African president was supposed to marvel, not interrogate. "Your missile guidance systems," he commented during one demonstration. "They're using the same algorithmic approach we discussed at the Pan-African Defense Summit last year." A flash of surprise crossed a Russian general's face. He hadn't expected Traoré to recognize the technology, much less contextualize it within broader military developments. That evening at a state dinner hosted in the Kremlin, Ibrahim sat quietly as Putin regaled the table with stories of Russian military might. The wine flowed freely, and with it, the condescension grew bolder. "In Africa," one general said, glass in hand, "you must find our technological advances quite overwhelming." Traoré smiled, a genuine smile that confused the table. "In Africa," he replied, sipping water instead of wine, "we learned that true power never announces itself. It simply reveals itself when necessary." The table fell awkwardly silent. Putin studied him with newfound curiosity. The request seemed absurd to Russian officials. Let an African president, a former soldier, yes, but not one of their own, fly one of the pride jewels of Russian aerospace. Putin leaned in, voice low. "You understand this is not a tourist attraction. These jets cost millions. You break it, we go to war." "I understand," Ibrahim said quietly, "but I didn't come here to be impressed. I came here to understand power and earn respect." The room fell silent for a beat, then laughter again, but Traoré gazed and flinched. Not once. The Russian defense minister stepped forward, his metals clinking like armor. "Mr. President," he addressed Putin, not Ibrahim, "perhaps our distinguished guests would prefer a simulator experience, much safer for everyone involved." Ibrahim's jaw tightened imperceptibly. This was the dance of diplomacy he had come to expect, offering less while pretending to give more. "A simulator," he echoed, his voice level. "Interesting how we're always offered the simulation instead of the reality." The room temperature seemed to drop. Several military officials exchanged glances. Putin studied Ibrahim's face with newfound interest. This wasn't going according to plan. The African leader was supposed to accept a compromise, take the conciliatory option, and leave with handshakes and empty promises of military cooperation. "Tell me, President Traoré," Putin asked, genuine curiosity edging into his voice, "what military experience do you actually have? Your file mentions service, but details are sparse." Ibrahim looked directly at Putin. "With respect, President Putin, my file contains what others thought important enough to write down. My experience is what I carry here." He touched his temple lightly. "And here," His hand moved to his heart. An aide whispered in Putin's ear. The Russian president's eyebrows raised slightly. You were involved in counterinsurgency operations in northern Burkina Faso. I was, Ibrahim replied, and the tactical repositioning after the Mali border conflict. I designed it. Putin's expression changed subtly. The room watched this exchange with growing unease. The script was changing. Still, the defense minister interjected. A Sukhoi 35 is not a jeep in the desert. It's one of the most sophisticated machines ever built. Ibrahim nodded in acknowledgement, as is the human mind when not underestimated. The standoff continued for several more minutes. Arguments about protocols, insurance, international incident risks, all the diplomatic language of no. Without saying a word directly, Ibrahim listened to it all patiently. When the voices finally quieted, he spoke just one sentence. I did not come to Russia to be told what I cannot do. Behind the scenes, one general, an older, war-hardened pilot named Dmitry Lavrov, requested a private word with Putin. Let him fly. Let the world see him fail. Humiliation is a weapon, too. Putin smirked. He approved the flight. But what happened next was not the humiliation they expected. Ibrahim was given a co-pilot as backup, but once in the cockpit, he requested full control. Against every protocol, Lavrov allowed it. The hangar doors opened. The Sukhoi 35 taxied out, and then he took off alone. The pre-flight briefing had been a formality, rushed and deliberately complicated. The Russian technical officer spoke quickly, pointing to controls with minimal explanation, occasionally using untranslated Russian technical terms. Ibrahim absorbed it all silently. When asked if he had questions, he simply shook his head. The flight suit they provided was slightly too large, a small psychological tactic, not lost on Ibrahim. Make the man feel small in his borrowed clothes. Make him feel like an imposter. As he walked toward the aircraft, he heard the whispers. 20,000 rubles says he aborts before takeoff. 50,000 says he crashes it. Putin will have his head if he scratches the paint. Ibrahim climbed the ladder with practiced movements. The cockpit wrapped around him, a symphony of buttons, switches, and displays. To the untrained eye, it would be overwhelming. But Ibrahim's eyes were not untrained. The assigned co-pilot, Major Alexei Voronsky, was a decorated test pilot with over 5,000 flight hours. He smiled thinly as Ibrahim settled into the main pilot seat. Perhaps, Mr. President, I should handle takeoff and landing. You can enjoy the middle part. Ibrahim fastened his harness. That won't be necessary. Major Voronsky's smile faltered. Sir, with respect, this isn't protocol. No, Ibrahim replied, but neither is what's about to happen. His fingers moved across the startup sequence with surprising familiarity. You may observe or you may exit. Your choice. The cockpit fell silent. Voronsky's jaw tightened, but professional curiosity won out. He stayed. Ground control's voice crackled to the communication system, speaking Russian first, then heavily accented English. Burkina 1, your flight path is restricted. Ceiling 10,000 meters, no urban overflight. Duration maximum 30 minutes. Ibrahim acknowledged the instructions. The engines hummed to life beneath him. The vibration was different from what he was used to, more refined, more power coiled like a spring. As he taxied toward the runway, Ibrahim noticed a small crowd that had gathered, military officials, diplomatic staff, and at the center, Putin himself, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The control tower gave clearance, reluctant permission wrapped in technical jargon. Ibrahim pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft responded instantly, hungry for speed, for sky. In those seconds of acceleration, something changed in Ibrahim. The diplomatic masks, the careful words, the measured responses, all fell away. Here, in this moment of pure physics and will, there was only truth. The wheels left Russian soil, the Sukhoi climbed, and Ibrahim Traoré was finally free. Within seconds of being airborne, he tilted the Sukhoi into a perfect vertical climb, stunning even the Russian pilots monitoring from ground control. Who trained him? Was he lying about his flight hours? He's pulling G's like a combat pilot. This isn't possible. High above Moscow, Traoré began executing aerial maneuvers that defied expectations. Barrel rolls, controlled dives, vertical stalls. Then he wrote an infinity symbol in the sky with his vapor trail, a symbol of limitless potential carved into clouds above the Kremlin. The Russian Air Force had no words. Putin's hand gripped the edge of the table. One advisor whispered, "He's not showing off. He's sending a message." The radio crackled with urgent commands. Burkina 1, reduce altitude immediately. Return to authorized flight pattern. Ibrahim acknowledged but continued his ascent. The sky darkened around him as he pushed higher, the curvature of the earth becoming visible at the horizon. In the monitoring room, chaos erupted. He's exceeding clearance by 5,000 meters. Oxygen levels in that cockpit must be dropping. Should we scramble intercept craft? Putin raised a hand for silence, his eyes never leaving the radar, tracking the African president's flight path. "No," he said quietly. "Let's see where this goes." In the cockpit, Ibrahim felt the aircraft responding to his touch like an extension of his body. Each maneuver flowed into the next, not the hesitant moves of someone testing limits, but the confident expression of someone who understood them intimately. The major beside him had gone from skeptical to stunned to something approaching reverence. "Where did you learn to fly like this?" he finally asked. Ibrahim executed another perfect roll before answering. "My grandfather was a griot, a storyteller. He said that when the French colonized our lands, they believed we couldn't master their machines, their writing, their ways. So they spoke freely in front of us, taught carelessly, assuming we couldn't truly learn. Their arrogance became our education." He banked the jet sharply, feeling the G-forces press against his body. "I learned to fly 15 years ago. First in simulators we built from scavenged parts. Then in aging French training craft. Later in Chinese J-10s during joint exercises. They thought we were just observing. I've flown your Sukhoi models, too, the older variants in Algeria, when no one thought to ask who I was." The major stared at him. "But there's no record." "There rarely is," Ibrahim said, "of what people don't think to look for." Below them, Moscow spread like a circuit board, power and history etched in steel and stone. Ibrahim brought the aircraft lower, tracing the edge of permitted airspace. Then he began the most ambitious sequence yet, a series of maneuvers that together would trace the outline of Africa in the sky above Russia. Each turn precise, each dive calculated, the vapor trails hanging in the cold air like a declaration. In the monitoring station, technicians scrambled to interpret the pattern forming above them. "It's deliberate," a young analyst said suddenly. "He's drawing something." As the shape became clear, the room fell silent again. On radar and in the sky, visible to anyone looking up, the continent of Africa hung above Moscow. Not a challenge, not a threat, a reminder. Putin's expression shifted from concern to something more complex. Respect, perhaps, or the recognition of a miscalculation. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting." The jet touched down with flawless grace. When Ibrahim stepped down from the cockpit, his uniform untouched by sweat, the silence was deafening. He approached Putin with the same quiet confidence he had walked in with hours earlier. Putin nodded once. A long pause. Then he extended his hand. "Maybe I misjudged you." Traoré smiled. "Or maybe you judged me before I even moved." The tarmac had transformed during Ibrahim's flight. What began as a small, dismissive audience had grown to include dozens of officials, military personnel, and notably, cameras that hadn't been present before. Ibrahim removed his helmet with practiced ease, handing it to a wide-eyed technician. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. The wind whipped across the airfield, but he stood unaffected, as though gravity itself held him with greater respect. Now the silence continued as he walked the 50 paces to where Putin waited. With each step, Ibrahim could feel the shift in atmosphere, from mockery to confusion to something approaching awe. Putin's face was a diplomat's mask, but his eyes had changed. The patronizing gleam was gone, replaced by calculation, reassessment. After their brief exchange, Putin gestured toward a nearby building. "Perhaps we should continue our discussions inside. I believe our agenda has expanded." Ibrahim nodded. "I would like that." As they walked, General Lavrov fell into step beside them. His earlier smugness evaporated. "That infinity symbol," he said quietly, just for their ears. "That was for us, wasn't it?" Ibrahim looked at him calmly. "The infinity symbol has many meanings, General. In mathematics, it represents endless possibility. In philosophy, the transcendence of limitations. In spirituality, the eternal cycle of death and rebirth." A pause. "You may choose which meaning was intended." The general studied him with new eyes. "And the outline of Africa?" Ibrahim's answer was simple. A reminder that geography is not destiny and borders do not contain potential. They entered a conference room that hadn't been on the original itinerary. This was a higher clearance space where real negotiations happened, not the ceremonial meetings planned for visiting dignitaries from minor nations. Putin dismissed most of the entourage with gesture. Only his closest advisors remained, along with Ibrahim's small security detail. Putin got straight to the point. "Those maneuvers, they're not standard training patterns, not even for our best pilots." "No," Ibrahim agreed. "They're not. Where did you develop them?" Ibrahim's answer surprised everyone. "In dreams. Initially, when fuel and aircraft are limited, you learn to fly in your mind first. I spent 1,000 nights flying before I ever left the ground." One of Putin's advisors scoffed, but the Russian president silenced him with a look. "Dreams become reality when given the chance," Putin said, sounding genuinely thoughtful. "An interesting philosophy for a military man." "I am a military man who wishes he didn't need to be," Ibrahim replied. "But the world gives us the role it believes we deserve, not the one we desire." Putin leaned forward. "And what role does Burkina Faso desire on the world stage, President Traoré?" The question hung in the air, the first time since his arrival that Ibrahim had been asked what he wanted rather than told what he could have. "Equality," he said simply. "Not charity, not condescension, not colonial echoes wrapped in new language. True partnership based on mutual respect." Putin's eyes narrowed slightly. "Respect is earned." Ibrahim held his gaze. "I believe I just did what had been scheduled as a perfunctory 30-minute diplomatic courtesy, stretched into 3 hours behind closed doors. Outside, speculation ran wild. Inside, the dynamic had fundamentally changed. Maps were spread across the table. Resource assessments, military analyses, economic projections. "Your rare earth mineral reserves," Putin noted, pointing to a region in Burkina Faso. "Our geological survey suggests they're more extensive than previously documented." Ibrahim nodded. "We've known this for some time. And yet you haven't developed them. Not with partners who value our resources more than our people." The afternoon stretched on. Coffee was brought in, then food. Occasionally, raised voices could be heard through the door, not just Putin's, Ibrahim's too. The staff exchanged glances. This was not proceeding according to protocol. Inside, Ibrahim remained uncompromising on key points. "Infrastructure development with no strings attached," he insisted. "There are always strings," Putin countered. "Then let them be visible, negotiated, and mutually beneficial, not hidden traps discovered once a pendency is established." At one point, the Russian defense minister leaned toward Ibrahim and said quietly, "You fly well, but diplomacy isn't aerobatics. There are realities you must accept." Ibrahim's response was measured but firm. "The reality I accept is this. Africa has been told for centuries what is and isn't possible. Today, I showed what happens when we question those limitations." As evening approached, a new agreement began taking shape. Military training programs, agricultural technology transfers, educational exchanges, infrastructure development with terms that raised eyebrows among Putin's advisors. "These terms are unusually favorable," one whispered to Putin. The Russian president's response was pragmatic. "Dignity is expensive. Pride is cheap. Today, we pay for the first to avoid the cost of the second." When they finally emerged, both men looked tired but satisfied. The waiting press captured the moment. The handshake, longer this time, more genuine. Ibrahim spoke briefly to reporters. "Today marks a new chapter in relations between our nations, one built on demonstrated capability, not presumed limitations." The Russian press secretary tried to regain control of the narrative, emphasizing Russia's generosity and leadership. But the story had already shifted beyond their grasp. Because while the negotiations were important, they weren't what the world would remember. They would remember the African leader who was underestimated, who calmly proved his worth, and who transformed mockery into respect within the span of a single flight. The footage, because everything was recorded, leaked, deliberately or not, no one knows. But what the world saw wasn't just an African president flying a Russian jet. They saw a symbol of underestimated strength rise and dominate on another nation's terms. Across Africa, Ibrahim Traoré became more than president. He became a myth, a quiet storm who did not shout to be heard. International commentators debated how he learned to fly. Military analysts scrambled for answers. But to the people, to those who had ever been doubted, dismissed, or demeaned, it didn't matter. He flew. They mocked. He conquered. Justice soared. Within hours of the footage reaching the internet, it had been viewed millions of times. News organizations scrambled to verify its authenticity. Experts were called in to analyze the flight patterns, and diplomats issued carefully worded statements. But in the streets, from Bamako to Baltimore, from Ouagadougou to Oslo, the response was visceral and immediate. Did you see what he did? They laughed at him. And then, that's how you answer disrespect. In university lecture halls, political scientists dissected the geopolitical implications. In military academies, tacticians analyzed the flight patterns for hidden meanings. In diplomatic circles, ambassadors reassessed their approach to African nations. Ibrahim returned to Burkina Faso the following day. The reception at home was unlike anything he had experienced before. Thousands lined the streets from the airport to the capital, many holding hand-drawn pictures of jets or simply the infinity symbol that had now become associated with him. A young girl broke through the security cordon, running up to Ibrahim with a paper airplane in her hand. "Teach me to fly, too," she said, offering him her creation. Ibrahim knelt down, taking the paper craft with the same seriousness he would give a state document. "The first step," he told her, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "is to never believe those who say you cannot." The moment was captured by dozens of cameras. By nightfall, it had become as viral as the jet footage itself. In corporate headquarters across Europe, America, and Asia, emergency meetings were called. The calculus of African engagement was suddenly shifting. "We need to reassess our approach to the Burkina Faso negotiations," a mining executive told his board in London. "The terms they rejected last month, we should reconsider them." In Beijing, diplomatic strategists reviewed their African initiatives with new urgency. "President Traoré will be receiving offers from everywhere now," one analyst noted. "Our previous assumptions about negotiating leverage may no longer apply." Even the IMF and World Bank found themselves in unusual territory. Loan conditions that had been standard practice for decades were now being questioned, not just by activists, but by mainstream economists. The optics have changed. A senior director admitted in a closed session, "We need to recognize that the traditional dynamics are evolving." What made these reactions so significant wasn't just their breadth, but their origin. Ibrahim hadn't demanded these reconsiderations. He hadn't issued threats or ultimatums. He had simply demonstrated capability in a way that could not be denied or diminished. And in doing so, he had activated a powerful force in international relations. Respect born of reassessment. Perhaps the most profound impact occurred in classrooms across Africa. In a school in Senegal, a teacher scrapped her planned history lesson to show her students the footage. "Today," she told them, "we're witnessing history, not just studying it." In Ghana, a physics professor used Ibrahim's flight to explain principles of aerodynamics, concluding with words that went beyond science. "The limitations others place on you are fictional. The ones you accept are real." In South Africa, a debate tournament changed its motion to, "This House believes the Traoré effect will fundamentally alter African diplomatic leverage." Young people particularly embrace the symbolism. Social media filled with variations of the infinity symbol, often accompanied by phrases like, "Watch me fly," or simply Burkina Infinity. When interviewed by CNN 2 weeks after the Moscow visit, Ibrahim was asked about becoming a symbol of African potential. His answer was characteristically measured. Symbols are important. They can inspire. But what matters more is what follows the inspiration. Will we convert this moment into lasting change? That's the real test. The interviewer pressed him. But surely you must feel some personal satisfaction. They underestimated you, and you proved them wrong in spectacular fashion. Ibrahim thought for a moment before responding. Personal satisfaction is fleeting. What lasts is institutional respect. That's what I'm working toward, not for myself, but for my nation and my continent. 6 months later, Vladimir Putin made an unprecedented state visit to Burkina Faso, the first by any Russian head of state. The streets of Ouagadougou were swept clean, buildings freshly painted. Security was elaborate, but unobtrusive. At the welcoming ceremony, Putin reviewed Burkina Faso's military honor, guard with Ibrahim at his side. When they reached the small but growing Air Force division, Putin paused. "You're pilots," he said, nodding toward the assembled officers. "They fly as well as their president?" Ibrahim smiled slightly. "Better. I only fly occasionally. They fly every day." That afternoon, the two presidents signed new cooperation agreements, more substantial, more specific, and notably more equitable than what had been drafted in Moscow. At the state dinner that evening, Putin raised his glass to partnership based on mutual respect and demonstrated capabilities. Ibrahim raised his in return, and to looking beyond appearances to see true potential. Later, as they stood on the balcony of the presidential palace, looking out over the city lights, Putin asked a question that had clearly been on his mind. That day in Moscow, was it all planned? Did you anticipate our reaction, engineer the entire demonstration? Ibrahim considered the question carefully, not in detail. But I knew what you expected of me, what the world expects of African leaders. Gratitude, deference, acceptance of whatever is offered. He paused. I simply chose a different path. Putin nodded slowly. A calculation. A necessity, Ibrahim corrected. Sometimes, to change a conversation, you must first change the assumptions underlying it. As they turned to go back inside, Putin made one final observation. You know, in Russian chess tradition, we have a saying, the best move is the one your opponent never considered possible. Ibrahim smiled. In Burkina Faso, we say something similar. The bird that flies highest sees farthest, but must first convince others it has wings. 3 years after the Moscow flight, its effects continued to ripple outward. Ibrahim Traoré remained president of Burkina Faso, though he had announced he would not seek another term. His focus, he said, was on institution building, not personal power. The Traoré doctrine became required study in diplomatic academies, a case study in how symbolic actions could reset international power dynamics. New infrastructure rose across Burkina Faso. Schools, hospitals, roads funded by international partnerships negotiated on more favorable terms than had ever seemed possible before. More significantly, a generation of young Africans had embraced Ibrahim's quiet confidence. Applications to engineering programs surged. Aviation clubs formed in villages that barely had electricity. Young entrepreneurs pitched investors with unprecedented boldness. On the 5th anniversary of what had become known simply as the flight, Ibrahim gave a rare international address at the United Nations. He didn't mention jets or Russia or his own role in changing perceptions. Instead, he spoke about potential, human potential, African potential, global potential, and the artificial barriers that constrain it. The greatest violence we can commit, he told the assembled world leaders, is to convince another human being that their dreams have predetermined limits based on where they were born, the color of their skin, or the assumptions made about their capabilities. As he concluded his speech, he offered a challenge disguised as an invitation. I stand before you not as an exception, but as an example, not of what one man can achieve, but what becomes possible when we refuse to accept the limitations others place upon us. The question now is not what I did yesterday, but what we all might accomplish tomorrow. The ovation lasted 7 minutes. But more telling was what happened afterward. Leaders from nations large and small lined up, not just to shake his hand, but to schedule substantive meetings. No one was laughing anymore. Everyone was listening. True power isn't in the weapons you hold. It's in the courage to face doubt and the silence you create when you prove them wrong. The legacy of Ibrahim Traoré's flight wasn't really about aerobatics or international diplomacy. It was about the moment when someone stands tall in the face of diminishment and says, through actions rather than words, I am more than your perception of me. I am more than my history allows. I am more than the limitations you imagine for me. Perhaps that's why the story resonated so deeply, far beyond politics or geopolitical strategy. Because in every classroom, boardroom, and household, people know what it feels like to be underestimated, and they know the quiet power of proving those estimates wrong. Ibrahim never spoke publicly about the details of that day in Moscow, never bragged about outmaneuvering Russian expectations or outsmarting diplomatic protocols. When asked directly in interviews, he would simply say, "It was just a flight. The rest is what people needed it to be." But the infinity symbol he traced in the Russian sky became something more than a flight pattern. It appeared on school notebooks, on business cards, as tattoos and graffiti and corporate logos, not because it represented one man's achievement, but because it captured an eternal truth. Potential, once unleashed, has no limits. Respect, once earned, changes everything. And sometimes, the quietest statement speaks the loudest of all. 10 years after flight, a young woman from a small village outside Ouagadougou became the first Burkinabe astronaut, joining an international mission to the International Space Station. As she climbed into the launch vehicle, a reporter called out a final question. What inspired you to reach the stars? She smiled, touching the small infinity pin on her flight suit. A president who showed us that the sky is not a limit. It's just a beginning. As the rockets ignited and she soared upward, Ibrahim Traoré, now retired from politics and teaching mathematics to children, watched the launch from a small television in his modest home. A student asked him, "Are you proud, Professor, that your flight led to this?" Ibrahim shook his head slowly. "No," he said quietly. "I'm grateful because this was always possible. All I did was refuse to accept that it wasn't." The rocket disappeared into the blue, carrying with it not just a person, but a principle. True power doesn't announce itself with threats or boasts. It demonstrates itself through action. And once demonstrated, it can never be unseen.